The roadside diner was a relic of another time. A flickering neon sign hummed against the still desert night, its pink glow casting faint shadows across the cracked asphalt. Inside, the place smelled of fresh coffee, frying bacon, and old grease, the kind of scent that soaked into the walls and never really left. Frank Delaney, a man who had lived through more wars than he cared to remember, sat at the counter, stirring a spoon idly through his coffee. He wasn't a man who sought trouble. He was a man who had already seen enough of it, his hands scarred and calloused, wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. He liked this place, the quiet, the way nobody asked questions. Just a meal, some coffee, and a moment to himself. But then, the sound of engines. Not one, not two, a dozen. The deep guttural roar of motorcycles rolling in like a slow-moving storm. The vibrations rattling the diner windows. The few other patrons, a trucker in the corner, a teenage waitress, and the old diner owner, exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew what was coming. Frank didn't turn around. He simply lifted his mug and took another slow sip. The hellhounds had arrived. The glass door swung open, and the gang strode in like they owned the place. Leather vests, scars, greasy hair. Tattoos that told stories most wouldn't live to repeat. Their leader, Mace, stepped in first, tall, broad, covered in ink, with a knife tucked into his belt and a serpent tattoo curling around his throat. His cold, dead eyes swept over the diner before settling on Frank. Mace didn't recognize him, and that was his first mistake. Well, Mace drawled, his voice thick with amusement as he scanned the room. Ain't this cozy? Just a bunch of nobodies enjoying their night. His men chuckled, spreading out. Boots clomped against the tiled floor. A chair scraped against the ground, as one of them kicked it over for no reason other than to hear it fall. The trucker in the corner hunched lower, eyes fixed on his plate. The waitress gripped her notepad so tightly her knuckles went white. But Frank just kept drinking his coffee. Mace grinned, stepping closer. He gestured toward Frank without looking at him. What about you, Grandpa? You look like the kind of man who's seen some things. You like the quiet, huh? Frank didn't answer, didn't look up. That annoyed Mace. You deaf old man, one of the bikers sneered, stepping closer, his boots stopping just inches from Frank's stool. The tension in the diner thickened, the kind that pressed against the chest, heavy, suffocating. Frank finally set his mug down, slowly, deliberately. He exhaled through his nose, then spoke in a voice calm and steady. Just trying to enjoy my meal. The words were simple, not a threat, not a challenge. But the way he said them, it made every single biker pause. Mace's grin flickered. He studied Frank closer now, eyes narrowing, the faded Marine Corps tattoo on Frank's forearm. The way he sat so still, so aware, so steady. Mace had seen tough men before, but this was different. He scoffed, masking his unease. Yeah, well, maybe we don't like the way you're enjoying it. One of his men, Boone, took it further. He leaned in, grabbed Frank's coffee, and poured it out onto the counter. The dark liquid spilled over, dripping onto the floor. The entire diner went silent. Even the waitress stopped breathing. Frank sat there, staring at the spilled coffee. No anger, no reaction, just stillness. And that stillness? That was the moment when Mace should have known to walk away. Instead, he laughed. His gang laughed with him. Boone grinned wide, proud of himself, and clapped Frank on the back. Hey, old man, you ain't mad, are ya? Frank finally turned his head. His eyes, cold, sharp, unreadable, locked onto Boone's. Boone's grin faltered. For the first time, he felt it. That feeling, like when a man steps too close to the edge of a cliff and realizes the ground beneath him isn't solid anymore. Frank's voice was low, measured, final. You done? The way he said it, soft, quiet, yet somehow louder than anything else in the room, made the hairs on the back of Boone's neck stand up. For the first time since they walked in, the gang wasn't laughing anymore. Mace clenched his jaw, not liking the shift in the air. He stepped forward, slamming a heavy hand onto Frank's shoulder. Yeah, old man, he sneered. We're done, but you ain't. The message was clear. Frank wasn't getting out of this diner without a fight, and that was their second mistake. The weight of Mace's hand pressed against Frank's shoulder, rough and uninvited. The whole diner seemed to shrink. the air thick with the expectation of what was about to happen. The other customers sat frozen, wide-eyed, too afraid to move. The waitress clutched her notepad to her chest, her breathing shallow. Even the trucker in the corner had put down his fork, his eyes darting toward the door, weighing his odds if he ran. Frank remained perfectly still, like a statue carved from old stone. His fingers flexed once against the counter before relaxing again. He had spent his life in places just like this. Not diners, but situations. Situations where the air felt wrong, where men thought they held power until the moment they realized they didn't. Mace leaned in, his voice a low growl. "I asked you a question, old man. You got a problem with us?" Frank exhaled slowly, controlled, his mind calculating every possibility, every movement, every weakness. He had spent a lifetime learning how to read men, and he read Mace now like an open book. The tattoos weren't just for show. The scars on his knuckles meant he had seen his fair share of fights, but he fought like a bully, not like a soldier. There was a difference. Frank lifted his coffee mug, what little was left in it, and turned it over, letting the last drop spill onto the counter. He set it down gently, looking Mace in the eye. "No problem," he said evenly, "but I'd appreciate it if you took your hand off me." For a second, Mace didn't move. Then he laughed. A sharp barking sound, echoed by the rest of the gang. The tension in the room shifted, not dissipating, but changing. "You hear that, boys?" Mace sneered, turning to his men. "Grandpa here thinks he's got some say in how this goes." Boone, still nursing the sting of whatever had passed between him and Frank moments before, grinned. "Maybe we ought to teach him how things work out here." Frank still didn't move. "You don't want to do that." Mace's smirk froze just a little at the calm in Frank's voice, but he shoved the feeling down, turning it into rage instead. With a quick motion, he grabbed Frank's Marine Corps jacket from the back of the chair and yanked it away, holding it up like a prize. "Look at this," Mace said, inspecting it like some cheap novelty. "Marine Corps. That right, old man? You a soldier once?" Frank's fingers curled against the counter, slow, methodical. His heartbeat never changed. Boone whistled, leaning closer. "Damn, maybe he was some kind of war hero. That true, Grandpa? You kill people?" Frank let the question hang in the air. Mace's grin widened. "Yeah, I bet he did," he mused. "Bet he's got stories. Bet he's got memories." His tone shifted, his words dripping with mock sympathy. "Ever wake up screaming, old man? Ever get that feeling like you never really left whatever hellhole they sent you to?" The gang laughed, but it was forced now, nervous. They were trying too hard. They knew, somewhere, deep down, they were prodding something they shouldn't. Frank slowly turned his stool, his boots settling firmly on the tiled floor, his back straightening. For the first time since they walked in, he faced them fully. His eyes, sharp, calm, unshaken, locked onto Mace's. "Son," Frank said, his voice soft, unthreatening, but final, "you're making a mistake." Mace's grin flickered, just for a second, just long enough for Frank to see it. And then, without warning, Mace threw the jacket on the floor and stomped his boot down on it. A beat of silence. Frank's fingers twitched. Mace sneered, thinking he had won. "What now, Grandpa? You gonna—" He never got to finish. Frank moved. 1 second he was seated. The next, he was a force of nature. His left hand shot up, grabbing Mace's wrist in a steel grip before the biker even realized what was happening. In a single motion, Frank twisted, a brutal, precise maneuver that sent Mace's entire body weight forward, slamming him face first onto the counter with a sickening crack. The impact sent dishes flying, coffee spilling, silverware clattering to the floor. Mace let out a strangled gasp, blood already pooling from his nose. Then, chaos. Boone lunged, reaching for Frank, but Frank was faster. He pivoted, grabbing Boone's arm and yanking him into a table. The flimsy wood shattered, Boone crumpling beneath the debris, groaning in pain. The rest of the bikers reacted too late. Frank was already moving. Another thug swung a punch. Frank ducked, drove his elbow into the man's ribs, then followed up with a brutal knee to the stomach. The biker collapsed, wheezing, clutching his gut. The diner was a war zone now. One of the younger gang members pulled a knife. The waitress screamed. Frank saw it, calculated it, reacted. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic plate. and flung it with surgical precision. It hit the biker's hand before the blade fully left his grip. The knife clattered to the floor. The kid yelped, clutching his fingers. "Walk away," Frank said, his voice low, commanding. Not a request, a demand. But one idiot didn't listen. Another biker rushed forward, rage in his eyes. He was young, angry, full of something stupid. He aimed for Frank's face with a wild, swinging punch. Frank didn't dodge. He stepped forward into the attack, catching the arm mid-swing. With practiced efficiency, he twisted, flipping the biker over his shoulder. The gang member hit the ground hard, groaning in agony. Silence. The rest of the hellhounds froze, their faces pale, their bravado shattered. Mace, still dazed and bleeding against the counter, looked up at Frank, and for the first time in his miserable life, he knew fear. Frank adjusted his jacket, his voice calm but absolute. "You boys got two choices. You can pick up your trash and leave." He let that sink in, his gaze sweeping over the ruined diner, the groaning bodies on the floor, the humiliated men who thought they were the predators but had just learned what real danger looked like. "Or," Frank said, taking a step closer, "I can make sure none of you walk out of here at all." No one spoke. Then Mace spat blood, coughed, and muttered, "Let's go." His men hesitated. They looked at him, then at Frank, then at the absolute wreckage around them, and one by one, they staggered for the door. The diner remained silent as they filed out, their boots dragging, their pride left behind. Frank exhaled, finally turning back to the counter. "Think I'll take another coffee," he said. The waitress, still wide-eyed, nodded quickly and grabbed the freshest pot she could find. The door slammed shut behind the last of them, the rattling glass settling back into silence. Outside, the roar of motorcycles ignited, engines revving like wounded animals desperate to flee. But no one moved inside the diner. Not yet. The waitress still clutched the coffee pot in both hands, her knuckles white, her breath uneven. The trucker in the corner let out a long, shaky exhale, adjusting the cap on his head like he'd just witnessed something he had no business seeing. Frank sat back down, lifting his mug like nothing had happened. "Refill?" he asked. The waitress blinked. Yeah, of course." She hurried over, pouring the steaming liquid, her hands still trembling. Frank nodded his thanks, taking a slow sip. She hesitated, glancing toward the shattered table, the overturned chairs, the blood splattered on the counter where Mace's face had met it. "You sure they won't come back?" Frank set his mug down with a soft clink. "Oh, they'll come back." The trucker let out a groan. "Aw, hell, man, they're gonna bring friends? You think you scared them? All you did was piss them off." Frank didn't argue. He knew exactly how this worked. Men like Mace didn't walk away from humiliation without needing to prove themselves. He could almost see it now. Mace nursing his wounds, his pride shattered, his boys looking at him with doubt in their eyes. No, the hellhounds wouldn't let this stand. Frank reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn flip phone, the kind most people hadn't used in years. The waitress stared at it like it was an ancient artifact. "You got service on that thing?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Enough," Frank muttered, flipping it open. The call rang twice before a voice picked up on the other end, gruff, knowing. "Thought you were retired," the voice said. Frank exhaled. "So did I." A pause, then, "How bad?" "They'll be back," Frank replied, his eyes drifting toward the diner windows, toward the long, empty stretch of highway. "With numbers." "How long you got?" Frank looked at the clock behind the counter. The hellhounds wouldn't ride far. They'd regroup at the nearest dive bar, lick their wounds, fuel their anger. Maybe an hour, maybe less. "Not long," Frank said. The voice on the other end grunted. "You need backup?" Frank considered that. It had been a long time since he'd made this call, since he had needed to. His past life had been filled with men who didn't just fight, they ended fights. He still remembered the last time they'd gone to war together. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but tonight he just might have to be. "Come if you can," Frank said simply. The voice didn't ask any more questions. "See you soon," it said, then the line went dead. Frank flipped the phone shut, sliding it back into his pocket. The trucker watched him, frowning. "What the hell was that? An old friend?" The man shook his head, standing. I'm getting out of here before this turns into something ugly. You don't want to stay for the show? Frank asked, a slight smirk touching his lips. Not my kind of entertainment, the trucker muttered, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the counter before hurrying out the door. The waitress hesitated. You think you should go too? I mean, this ain't your fight? Frank looked at her, his expression unreadable. They made it my fight the second they stepped on my jacket. She swallowed hard, but nodded. There was something in the way he said it, final, absolute, that told her she wouldn't convince him otherwise. The diner was quiet again, but not for long. The weight in the air had shifted, the moment before the storm. Frank took another slow sip of coffee, waiting, and then the distant roar of engines, louder this time, more of them. A horde of headlights emerged on the highway, rolling toward the diner like a pack of hungry wolves. Frank counted the engines, listening. They had doubled their numbers. They were coming back for blood. Frank sighed, stretching his shoulders, feeling the old stiffness in his joints. He had been out of the fight for a long time, but it looked like tonight wasn't the night to stay retired. The ground trembled beneath the weight of approaching engines. The distant glow of headlights spread like wildfire across the horizon, growing brighter, closer, hungrier. They were coming, and this time, they weren't laughing. Frank Delaney sat at the counter, finishing the last sip of his coffee. Outside, the hellhounds were rolling back in, this time with twice as many riders. They had regrouped, spread word, gathered more bodies, more rage, more weapons. He could already picture Mace at the front of the pack, his face swollen, his nose still dripping blood from where it had met the counter. The waitress stood frozen near the register, eyes wide, her breathing unsteady. "Jesus," she whispered. "You were right. They came back." Frank set down his mug. They always do. The trucker had been smart to leave, but there wasn't much time for anyone else to make that choice now. The Black Hounds had returned for vengeance, and Frank knew exactly how this would play out. They wouldn't come in looking to throw a few punches and walk away. This wasn't about ego anymore. This was about control. And if men like Mace thought they were losing it, they'd burn the whole damn place down just to prove otherwise. Frank adjusted his jacket, rolling his shoulders, feeling the familiar tingle of adrenaline creeping through his veins. It had been a long time since he'd felt it. The anticipation. The moment before violence, before war. The flip phone in his pocket buzzed. One short vibration. No words, no greetings, just a signal. They were close. Frank exhaled, steadying himself. He turned to the waitress. "You got a back exit?" She nodded quickly. "Yeah, but it's locked. Only the owner has the keys." "Find him. Get out the back. Now." She hesitated. "What about now?" His tone made it clear. This wasn't her fight. She wasn't built for it. She didn't need to see what was coming. Outside, the bikes came to a rolling stop. Engines cut off. The air felt wrong. Frank slid off the stool and turned toward the door just as it swung open violently, the force rattling the windows. Mace stood in the doorway, his face bruised, his lips split, his rage barely contained. His jacket was off now, his bare arms covered in ink and fresh cuts. Behind him, 20 men, all just as ugly, all just as pissed. Some had knives, some had chains, some had guns. Frank stood in the center of the diner, unmoving. "Didn't think we'd come back?" Mace growled, stepping forward. "Thought you could just beat my boys and walk away?" Frank didn't answer. He just watched, eyes calm, controlled. Mace's lips curled into something ugly. "You don't look so tough now, old man." Frank let out a slow breath. "You're right." Mace blinked. "What?" "You brought an army," Frank said, nodding toward the sea of men behind him. "And me? I'm just one guy." Mace grinned, mistaking Frank's words for surrender. "Damn right." Then, the first gunshot. Not from inside the diner, from the parking lot. A sudden sharp crack split through the night, and one of Mace's men crumpled to the ground, screaming, clutching his knee. The bikers froze, confusion flashing through them like wildfire. Then, another shot. Another biker dropped. The air erupted into chaos. From the darkness outside, figures emerged, shadows stepping into the dull glow of the diner's neon lights. Boots hit the pavement. Silhouettes moved with precision, discipline, training. Not bikers. soldiers. Reaper walked in first, rifle slung low, a combat knife sheathed at his belt. Behind him, the rest of Ghost Company, men built from war, men who had left it behind but had never forgotten how to fight it. Mace turned, his confidence shattering in real time. "The hell is this?" he spat. Reaper tilted his head. "You really thought he was alone?" Frank cracked his knuckles. Bad assumption. And then, the fight exploded. One of Mace's men panicked, pulled a gun, but before he could aim, Reaper moved like lightning, stepping in and slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's face. Blood sprayed across the tiles. Another biker lunged for Frank with a switchblade. Frank caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted it until the bones popped, then sent the man crashing into a table. The diner erupted into fists, boots, and shattering glass. A biker grabbed a chair, swung it at one of Ghost Company's men, only to be tackled to the ground, his face slammed against the tile in one fluid motion. Reaper turned, dodged a wild punch, then drove his elbow into a man's throat. The biker choked, stumbled, collapsed. Frank moved through the chaos like a ghost, calculated, ruthless, efficient. One man swung at him. Frank ducked, countered with a sharp uppercut. Another reached for his belt. Frank slammed his forearm into the back of his head, sending him sprawling. Mace tried to run. Frank saw it. The gang leader bolted for the door, shoving past his own men, panic in his eyes. Frank caught him. He grabbed Mace's collar, spun him around, and drove a fist straight into his gut. Mace gasped, crumpling to his knees, coughing violently. Frank crouched in front of him, gripping the back of his head. "You should have stayed down the first time," Frank said. Mace didn't answer. He was too busy trying to catch his breath. By the time it was over, the diner was wrecked. Broken tables, shattered dishes, groaning men on the floor. The remaining bikers who could still stand had already fled into the night, abandoning their fallen. Frank exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His knuckles were raw, his heartbeat steady. Reaper stepped up beside him, glancing down at Mace. "You want me to bury this one somewhere?" Frank shook his head. "Number? Let him crawl away. He'll tell the story." Reaper grinned. "Damn! You always did know how to send a message." Frank adjusted his jacket, stepping back toward the counter. The waitress peeked her head out from the kitchen, eyes wide with shock. Frank gave her a small nod. "I'll still take that refill." She let out a nervous laugh, stepping forward, pouring the coffee with shaking hands. Frank lifted the mug, took a sip, and finally, he had peace. At least for tonight.